The lighthouse on Harrow's Edge. There was an old lighthouse, solitary and imposing, standing on a jagged cliff called Harrow's Edge. The island was small, barely more than a rock in the sea, and its coastline was plagued by deadly tides and merciless winds. The lighthouse had once been a beacon for sailors, guiding them safely through treacherous waters. But for the last decade, no ship had needed its light, and no one had tended to it. The keeper, an elderly man named Silas Moreau, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind nothing but his journals and the faint memory of his existence. The island was soon forgotten. But that was all before Ben took the job. Ben was a young man in his late 20s, eager for work and with few options. He had heard rumors about the lighthouse, stories that didn't seem to make sense, tales of flickering lights in the dead of night when no one was around, and the strange, disorienting sounds carried by the wind. But those stories, to Ben, were nothing more than local superstition, born out of fear and isolation. Desperate for a steady paycheck, Ben accepted the offer to take over as the new keeper of the lighthouse, despite the strange warnings from the locals. They told him the island was cursed, that the lighthouse had driven men mad, and that it had a hunger for those who dared live too close. Ben didn't believe them. His mind was set. It was just a job. The boat ride to the island was long and bumpy, and by the time he reached the rocky shore, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world shrouded in darkness. The lighthouse stood against the fading light, its towering silhouette casting a long shadow across the beach. The light at the top was dim and pulsed irregularly, as if it were struggling to stay on. Ben walked up the narrow path leading to the base of the lighthouse, dragging his suitcase behind him. The air was thick with the smell of salt water, and the sound of the crashing waves filled the silence. As he entered the lighthouse, the door creaked loudly behind him, and he shivered as the wind howled through the cracks in the old building. Inside, the lighthouse was dimly lit by oil lamps, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows across the stone walls. The spiral staircase wound upward, its steps groaning with every step he took. Ben reached the top where the large, weathered lantern sat. It was his responsibility now to keep the light on and guide any lost ships to safety. His first few hours in the lighthouse were uneventful, though the silence felt suffocating. The isolation pressed in on him like a heavy weight, and he found himself looking out over the dark expanse of the sea, his gaze following the flickering light that swept across the waters. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the cracks of the lighthouse. Ben lay in the small cot in the keeper's quarters, staring at the ceiling. He was trying to sleep, but something felt wrong. His thoughts kept drifting back to the strange stories he'd heard, about Silas, the old keeper, who had gone mad before vanishing without a trace. Then, at the stroke of midnight, the first sound came. A faint tapping, soft at first, like a distant knock on a door. Ben sat up in bed, his heart racing. The sound came again, louder this time, and it seemed to be coming from the walls. He pulled himself out of bed and crept toward the source of the noise. It was coming from behind the wall of the small room he had settled into. He grabbed a lantern, its flame casting a jittery glow, and pressed his ear to the wall. The tapping continued, steady, rhythmic, like the tapping of a finger. Ben's stomach twisted in unease. The noise didn't sound natural. It was deliberate. There was something intentional about it, as if it was trying to get his attention. He backed away from the wall, a chill creeping up his spine. Was it the wind? Some kind of structural shift in the old building? He couldn't be sure, but the tapping was too regular to be coincidental. His curiosity got the best of him, and he decided to investigate. Grabbing a small hammer, he began to chip away at the wall, the sound of his strikes echoing through the quiet lighthouse. After several minutes of work, a small section of the wall gave way, revealing a hidden space behind it. A narrow, dark passageway stretched into the heart of the lighthouse, the air thick with dust. Ben hesitated, but his determination to understand what was happening won over his fear. He stepped into the passageway, the beam of his lantern barely cutting through the darkness. The air felt unnaturally cold, It seemed to press in around him, the silence so complete that he could hear the beating of his own heart. The walls here were rough stone, covered in strange, faded markings, scratches, symbols, and lines that didn't make sense. He ran his hand along one of the walls, feeling a vibration, almost like a hum under his fingertips. And then he saw it. At the far end of the passageway, a door stood slightly ajar. The tapping had stopped, and the silence was deafening. Ben felt a compulsion to move toward it, an unexplainable pull in his chest, as if the door was calling to him. He pushed it open. Inside was a small, circular room. In the center of the room was an old wooden desk, covered in yellowed papers, old maps, and a few rusted tools. But it wasn't the desk that caught Ben's attention. It was the figure standing in the corner. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized it was a man. His clothes were tattered, his hair long and unkempt. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as if he hadn't seen the light of day in years. And his eyes, those eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, an unnatural, sickly green. The figure tilted its head, staring at Ben with a knowing, hollow expression. The man's mouth moved, but no sound came out. It was as if he was speaking, but his words were trapped inside. Suddenly, the lantern flickered, casting a brief, violent shadow across the room. Ben blinked, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. His breath caught in his throat. The room was empty. Panic surged through him. He ran back to the staircase, his footsteps heavy and fast. But as he reached the top of the lighthouse, something was different. The light, the beacon that had been shining steadily, had gone dark. He rushed to the control panel, but no matter what he did, the light wouldn't turn on. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And then he heard it again. The tapping. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the sea. Ben ran to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. Down below, the water had grown unnaturally still. The waves were silent, as though the ocean itself was holding its breath. In the distance, he saw something moving in the water. A shape, something large and unnatural, moving toward the shore. The lighthouse light flickered again, and Ben realized with growing horror that it wasn't a beacon for ships. It was a lure, drawing something from the depths. Suddenly, the door to the lighthouse slammed open. The wind howled louder than ever, and the floor beneath Ben's feet trembled. He spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. The figure was gone. And then the whispering began. It was faint at first, barely audible over the roaring wind, but it grew louder. A voice, low and guttural, whispered his name. Ben, Ben. The voice echoed all around him, growing in volume, a chorus of countless whispers, as though the lighthouse itself had become a mouth, speaking to him from every corner. Ben's mind reeled. The island, the lighthouse, the keeper, none of it was normal. The light had been calling to something, something old and ancient, something buried beneath the sea, and now it was coming for him. Desperate, he rushed to the staircase, but as he descended, the tapping began again. This time, it was on the metal steps themselves, growing faster, louder, more insistent. His head was spinning. He had to escape. But when he reached the base of the lighthouse, the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, as though something was holding it shut from the outside. He turned, his pulse racing, and saw it, emerging from the shadows, standing at the foot of the staircase. A figure, pale, emaciated, with eyes that gleamed with hunger, and behind it, a long, inky shadow stretched across the floor, as though the darkness itself had come alive. The last thing Ben heard before the door finally broke open was the voice whispering once more, "We've been waiting for you, Ben." When the rescue team arrived a week later, they found the lighthouse as they'd left it, silent and abandoned. But the light at the top of the tower was flickering again, casting its cold, haunting glow over the water. And in the sand by the shore, a single footprint led into the ocean. And the lighthouse waited, its light sweeping the waves, calling for the next keeper to take the place of the one before.